Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan and today we have a pretty massive video for you guys. It's going to be the evolution of starships and also a few different other factors within how starships are utilized. We'll be talking about the legendary Rebel trio, A-Wings, X-Wings, and Y-Wings. We'll also be covering the TIE Fighter. Then we'll be taking a look at the evolution of certain types of capital ships like the Hammerhead line, along with the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, and also the Super Star Destroyer variant. There are going to be a lot of different types of ships we'll be looking at here. We'll also be taking a look at how the Rebel Alliance Starfighter Corps evolved from the beginning of the war to the end of the war. You're going to see a lot of changes in the mindset and the type of starfighters they're going to be using. And lastly, we're also going to talk about the evolution of size of these warships. As you'll see, they get gradually bigger and bigger and bigger throughout the course of history as there's more war, as there's more escalation in this sort of arms race, I guess. Well, this video is about an hour and a half. I hope you guys enjoy it. Get some nice snacks and a drink or something. And yeah, let's go. Today we're going to look at a class of ship so large that Rebel Alliance leader Mon Mothma once remarked that if the rebels were actually able to capture such a vessel, that it would be impossible for them to find enough crew to operate it. We of course are talking about the Star Dreadnought class of warships, otherwise commonly called the Super Star Destroyer class. These are more like mobile cities than just warships. These gigantic vessels symbolize the power of the Empire at its height just decades after the end of the Clone Wars. Today we're going to be looking at the evolution of the Star Dreadnought and find out where its roots come from in Star Wars history. The Star Dreadnought was a statement. It was a massive endeavor that could only be constructed by the richest systems and the most powerful militaries. It wasn't just a regular ship of the line, a generic battleship designed to pummel other ships of the same class. A Star Dreadnought stuck out purposely from your average capital ship. It was designed to inspire its allies and bring dread to its enemies. It usually did this through its immense size, but a Star Dreadnought was not just determined by its size, but also by the amount of firepower it had and also by how fast it could move. The Star Dreadnought was the centerpiece of any navy, and beyond functioning just as a command vessel, the ship itself was also a base for an entire fleet operating far from home. When you found yourself walking inside a massive dreadnought, the horrors of the front faded away. You felt safe and secure. And that is perhaps where we need to start. Since man first started sending ships into space, he has always been wary of the dangers of vacuum. The fear of finding themselves floating amongst the stars without protection after some mechanical failure to the ship. So the idea of building larger and larger ships with more compartments and layers and reinforced bulkheads to separate vulnerable organic beings from the vast coldness of space is ingrained in our very DNA at a very primal level. Throughout the history of Star Wars, there have been many galactic-wide disasters that have led to the destruction of major civilizations, which therefore led to technological dark ages. You had the mysterious disappearance of the Celestials. Then you had the destruction of the Qua, which led to the rise and the fall of the Rakatan Infinite Empire. But this current age, the one where the films we all know and love take place, started roughly around 30 to 10,000 years ago with the foundation of the Old Republic. This is when we first begin seeing more human-centric designs and naval doctrine that are a lot more familiar than the more alien designs of the Rakatans, or the Qua. Now remember, a dreadnought is not classified by its size, and in the earlier days of the Old Republic, ship sizes were considerably smaller than what we see during the Galactic Civil War period. Now the first starship that could really be classified as a Star Dreadnought can be found during the pre-Great Hyperspace War era. During this period, the Galactic Republic was still relatively young and untested. It was still expanding outwards from the mid-rim to establish control of the more wild areas of the galaxy. One of those obstacles that the Republic faced was the short-lived Kumari Empire led by Val Kumari. Not much is known about this period of time, but at its height, the Kumari Empire had over 30 different systems. Now, they were able to achieve this because they had massive battleships forming the flagships of their navy. One of those ships was the Cal-class battleship. Over 3,000 meters long and decked out with turbo lasers and one giant mass driver that ran along the entire length of the ship. The Cal-class battleship could not only take on a Republic fleet by itself, it could also do massive damage through orbital bombardment. Unlike lasers, kinetic energy weapons like a mass driver didn't decrease in effectiveness when it hit the atmosphere. The Kumari were eventually defeated by the Old Republic's massive numbers, and as usual, the Old Republic absorbed some of the technology from the Kumari after they took over, including the Cal-class battleship. So you might be asking now, why am I calling a Cal-class battleship a dreadnought when it clearly is called a battleship? Well, we're gonna have to define more clearly what a dreadnought actually is. So a dreadnought actually doesn't refer to a specific type of ship. Instead, it refers to the type of role a ship takes on. So a battleship can be a dreadnought, and so can a battle cruiser or just a light cruiser. Star dreadnoughts, as we mentioned before, mainly are used as command ships, have an overwhelming amount of firepower, armor, and usually have a pretty good propulsion system. Anyway, the Cal-class battleship really took the Republic fleet to the next level. Before this, the most massive ships in the Republic fleet were the Corp Galaxy System dreadnoughts, which are only 900 meters long. The Cal-class battleship would also be short-lived and would eventually be replaced by the ship simply known as the Republic-class command ship. These were massive star dreadnoughts that were kilometers long. We don't really have much information about their specs, but they were considerably larger than the standard capital ship. Now, to give you guys a little reference on how large the standard capital ship was, we have to look at the backbone of the Republic fleet, which were the smaller Hammerhead cruisers. These were by far one of the longest serving ships in the Republic and would see action from 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin to 1,000 years before the Battle of Yavin during various Sith Empire versus Republic and Jedi wars. Now, just to give you some reference on how much smaller ships during the Old Republic era was, the Hammerhead cruiser is basically the Old Republic equivalent of an Imperial-class Star Destroyer. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer was massive in size. It was 1,600 meters and over 5 times longer than the Hammerhead cruisers. So the ISD was much larger than your normal ship of the line during this period of time. As a matter of fact, during the Old Republic Mandalorian War period, the ISD probably would have been considered a Star Dreadnought. The command ships of this era would be the Inexpugnable class Dreadnought, close in size to the Cal-class battleship at 3,100 meters. It was so large that at the time it was considered a battle station. Little did they know, in the future, actual battle stations would be hundreds of times larger. With the Inexpugnable class, we began seeing the larger bridge designs we would see during the Galactic Empire era. They had wishing wells, which were pits that lined a bridge walkway where crew and officers operated the various controls and scanners for a capital ship. The first of these ships, the Swift Shore, was built prior to the beginning of the Mandalorian Wars and was specifically designed as a command ship for the Republic Hammerhead cruiser fleet. The Inexpugnable class was outfitted with a special sensor package that allowed it to pull off a tactic known as the Vandervalis chain. This slaved the controls of over 65 Hammerhead cruisers to one command ship. It gave the Inexpugnable class an unprecedented amount of control over a fleet. This tactic was mainly used to maintain blockades. In the next few decades, we begin seeing the Old Republic use the famous wedge-shaped design for its starships that would later become famous during the Galactic Empire period. The wedge-shaped capital ship was actually originally a Sith design and had been used in warships like the Harrower Dreadnought as early as 5,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. The wedge pyramid shape allowed more turbolasers to be placed on the hull with a larger firing radius. The replacement for the Inexpugnable class would be the Centurion battle cruiser. It incorporated this wedge-shaped design. Although it was much smaller than the Inexpugnable at 1,200 meters in length, it was more heavily armed and faster, which also followed the Sith Empire's wedge naval doctrine for dreadnoughts. These Centurion-class battlecruisers, along with the smaller wedge-shaped Interdictor-class Star Cruiser, would be utilized with great effect by the fallen Jedi Knight Revan against the Republic. The smaller Interdictor was only 600 meters long, but was capable of pulling ships out of hyperspace by preventing their hyperdrives from working by projecting an artificial gravity well around itself. In the next few thousands of years of fighting between the Jedi-led Republic and the Sith Empire, we would see many variants of super dreadnoughts come and go, like the Star of Coruscant, which remnants were scattered across Hoth, or the Invincible-class dreadnought heavy cruiser used by the Republic and corporate sector forces. Finally, around 1,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Ruusan Reformation, after the supposed destruction of the Sith, led to the demilitarization of the Republic military and Jedi forces. Similar to the post-galactic Civil War New Republic, the galaxy saw a massive redirection of federal military funding go to regional defense forces. Now, logically, you would think that the size of battleships and star dreadnoughts in general would get smaller, but actually the opposite happened. Giant shipbuilding worlds like Quat were now left defenseless against pirates and hostile foreign entities, and began heavily investing in ships that not only could defend their prized and vulnerable shipyards, but would make the very idea of attacking their systems suicidal. A philosophy that I'm sure Tarkin would have approved. This would be the beginning of the modern Star Dreadnought, starting off with the Procurator class battlecruiser. This massive 2,500 meter vessel would only mark the beginning of Quat Drive Yard's obsession with massive ships. The Procurator would be followed by the Praetor class battlecruiser, which was 4,000 meters long. And the Galactic Empire's Praetor class battlecruiser Mark II would be anywhere from 4,800 meters to 8,000 meters long. But before the Praetor Mark II was created, the first true dreadnought by modern naval standards was created in the Manticore class Star Dreadnought. These were 8,000 meter long vessels created by Quat Systems for their defensive fleet. Unfortunately, for most of these early modern Star Dreadnoughts, they were severely limited by the Ruusan Reformation's regulations, which usually limited the size of hyperdrives, armament, and shields on a ship. But when the Clone Wars started, the Manticore class Star Dreadnought Mark II was created, and this was an upgraded dreadnought that no longer needed to follow those regulations. After Order 66, Republic propaganda played down the role of the Jedi generals during the war and shifted more attention to the feats of the Manticore class Dreadnought Mark II. This was a part of the shift in narrative, which was designed to create more public support for future superclass dreadnoughts. The rise of the Empire marked the peak of the golden era for the wedge-shaped dreadnoughts. You had designs like the Bellator class dreadnought, which was derived from the Manticore class Mark II Star Dreadnought. The Bellator was 7,200 meters long and one of the smallest of the Dreadnought class. It was also one of the fastest and designed to hunt down much smaller Star Destroyers, which was a terrifying prospect. Then you had the Surtur class Star Dreadnought, which was 15 kilometers long and had the same output as 400 Imperial class Star Destroyers. Next up, we have the Executor class Super Star Destroyer. At 19 kilometers long with 13 enormous thrusters, the Empire built over a dozen of these ships, and Darth Vader himself used one as his personal command ship. The Executor class Star Dreadnought was rivaled in size only by one other ship, which was the Eclipse class Super Star Destroyer. At 17.5 kilometers long, it was shorter than the Executor class Star Dreadnought, but it had a huge forward hull and bow, which made it larger by volume. The Eclipse also featured a miniaturized version of the Death Star laser on board, which was capable of literally cutting ships in half. The Eclipse would become one of the few ships that weren't destroyed or captured by the New Republic in the latter years of the Galactic Civil War. It served as a home for the Imperial Remnant when they were on the run, and it would later on inspire the First Order to construct ships that were even larger in size, like Snoke's Supremacy, Omega class Star Dreadnought, which was no longer just a warship but the capital and headquarters for the entire First Order movement. The ship was almost as long as an Executor class Star Destroyer at 13.2 kilometers in length, but dozens of times wider at 60.5 kilometers in width. The Dreadnought was more than a ship. It was an idea that was supported by the more authoritarian governments of the galaxy. It was a symbol of large federal government and huge military spending. It was created through the sacrifices of the many and the nationalization of industries and the collective use of resources. It was designed to make citizens proud and fearful all at the same time. Unfortunately for those who built these massive ships, ultimately every Star Dreadnought would prove to be too slow, too vulnerable, or just plain too expensive when compared to a larger fleet of smaller ships. Because at the end of the day, no matter what period of time you're in, there are two things that are true about all military vessel design. The larger the vehicle, the larger a target is, and second, offensive weapons will always overpower any defenses, so the path to least resistance, aka avoiding getting hit by the enemy in the first place, will always be ideal. Today we'll be taking a look at the evolution of Rebel Starfighter squadrons throughout the Galactic Civil War. Although there were resistance cells and small regional rebellions throughout the entire reign of the Empire, things didn't really start to consolidate for the Rebel Alliance until a few years before the Battle of Yavin. In 5 BBY, General Jan Dodonna, a former captain of an Imperial-class Star Destroyer, was appointed leader of the Massassi group. The Massassi were a terrifying subspecies of the Sith race. They were deeply connected to the dark side and were fearsome warriors and one time a regular enemy of the Jedi and Republic. It was kind of an ironic name for Dodonna to choose, but they were located in a Massassi-built temple on Yavin 4. Anyway, in 2 BBY, a subunit of the Masashi group known as Phoenix Cell managed to steal 5 BTL Y-Wings slated for decommissioning and scrap. These Y-Wings would become the first starfighters used by the Rebellion. Simultaneously, the RZ-1A wing from Quad Systems Engineering would also be acquired by Phoenix Cell, and the T-65B X-Wing was already being secretly manufactured by Rebels with Incom Corporation's help. And so the Masashi group began fielding starfighter squadrons of all types based on color designation. You had Red Squadron, which usually fielded around a dozen X-Wings. Gold Squadron, which was an attack group that featured only Y-Wings. You also had Blue Squadron, which was known for fielding X-Wings and occasionally had U-Wings in support. Lastly, there was Green Squadron, which was famous for having only A-Wings during the post-Hoth period of the war. Now, the question I want to ask is, why are all these squadrons made up of only one type of starfighter? Well, it actually comes down to a few issues. First, aside from the Rebel base on Yavin 4, the Rebellion didn't have the capacity to house their fighter squadrons. The Rebel Navy at the time was mainly made up of small Corellian corvettes and frigates. Mon Calamari Mercantile Navy had yet to defect to the Rebellion, so there were no MC-80 cruisers either. The CR-90 Corvette at best could carry 3 A-Wings internally, with a few more docked externally, and the larger Nebulon B frigate could fit just about a squadron of X-Wings inside. This is one of the primary reasons why Rebel starfighters were almost all hyperdrive equipped. They needed to be able to travel far distances by themselves to a safe place where they could refuel and be refitted. The infrastructure, crew, and resources needed to maintain a starfighter squadron was quite complicated and very specific to the fighter craft you needed to keep operating. Every starfighter was quite different, so they had different spare parts, and there are also different certificates you had to basically get to be able to properly work on these machines. The mechanics in the Rebellion were overworked and oftentimes lacked the resources necessary to keep their squadrons running at full strength. Sometimes one starfighter had to be cannibalized to make sure that 3 other starfighters were running. And this, of course, was a lot easier when your entire squadron was made up of the same ship. This way you can share spare parts. This way the mechanics would basically all know how to work on each one of the ships because they were just trained to work on one type of ship. Now, the most fragile part of a starfighter squadron is actually the pilot. Organic beings need to be fed and drink. They have to relieve themselves, sleep, get exercise. You have to watch their physical health along with their neurological health as well. They're just as likely to malfunction as RZ-1A wings thrusters. And so, there were always more pilots than there were ships to fly. During the Battle of Yavin 4, a dozen or so pilots from Red and Gold Squadron were left behind because there just weren't enough ships for them to hop in. Most of these pilots also specialized in flying just one type of ship. Having multiple ships in a squadron would make it harder to rotate tired pilots in and out because it would require certain individuals to be cross-trained in flying multiple ships, which would actually decrease the overall effectiveness of a unit. That's not to say that some starfighter squadrons would change the type of fighters they would use throughout the course of their history. Green Squadron started out as an A-Wing squadron, but their entire unit was basically destroyed early on in the war by a squadron of TIE interceptors. Green Squadron would then re-emerge during the Battle of Atollon as a Y-Wing squadron, but again suffered heavy casualties and would become an X-Wing squadron during the Battle of Scarif. Years later at Endor, Green Squadron would once again be primarily an A-Wing squadron. So you'll notice every time Green Squadron changes what starfighters they use, it's usually because their entire unit has been wiped out so that they can start with a fresh new squad. Now, one of the cool things about the 3 starfighters used by the earlier Rebellion, the A-Wing, the X-Wing, and Y-Wing, was that they were all very flexible platforms. Not only did each one of these ships have hyperdrives, they also had shields and heavy weapons. The A-Wing, despite being a light interceptor, had the ability to take on much larger ships because it carried proton torpedoes. And the Y-Wing, despite being an assault starfighter bomber, still was maneuverable enough to hold its own against enemy fighters, and in the earlier years of the war was actually used for escort duty. And the X-Wing, of course, was the most flexible of them all, but all 3 of these fighters were self-sufficient. They didn't require escort units or anything like that, so they functioned pretty well as a squadron and were able to be self-sufficient on the battlefield. Now, there were some cases of mixed starfighter squadrons even early on in the war. You had Blue Squadron commanded by General Antok Merrick. Merrick wasn't your average starfighter commander. He was actually a general, which is a very weird rank to hold as a starfighter pilot, but whatever. More importantly, he was the commander of the Rebel Alliance Starfighter Command and had direct authority over which starfighters the Rebellion would use and how the logistical structure would be set up. It was Merrick who chose the X-Wing to be the backbone of the Rebel Starfighter Corps. He was also the one who would cycle the U-Wing out of escort duty and turn it into a support craft and troop transport. Blue Squadron was very much the premier starfighter unit in the earlier years of the Rebellion. On a side note, Red Squadron, the unit best known for taking down the Death Star, originally was supposed to be Blue Squadron, but because of the limitations of blue screen technology in the 70s, they were actually turned into the Red Squadron. Blue Squadron was basically an experimental unit thanks to its commander, Anton Merrick. They would be sent to Yadu to assure Galen Erso's death. During this mission, 5 Y-Wings would accompany the Blue Squadron and strike the Yadu energy conversion lab with proton bombs. This mission showcased the abilities of the Y-Wing and locked it in as the main assault bomber for the Rebellion. During the Battle of Scarif, Blue Squadron once again take the lead and rush the shield gate, this time supported by a U-Wing that also carried reinforcements to the Rogue One commando unit down below. Unfortunately, Blue Squadron would become trapped beneath the planetary shield and Anton Merrick would perish along with his unit. It is possible that had Anton Merrick survived that we would see more mixed starfighter squadrons. But at the Battle of Yavin, we see something a bit different. Instead of having a squadron of mixed fighters, you had one entire squadron of X-Wings that was supported by one entire squadron of Y-Wings. Each squadron had its own separate commander and its own mission. The X-Wings were supposed to fly cover for the Y-Wings and escort them to their targets, but there was a clear lack of coordination between these two squadrons, and Gold Squadron was quickly isolated and destroyed. After the destruction of the first Death Star, Rebel recruitment and funding did increase massively. But at the same time, the Empire would double their efforts to destroy the Rebellion, leading eventually to the evacuation of Hoth and the disastrous mid-rim retreat. For the most part, you still had starfighter squadrons made uniformly from one type of starfighter, and the Rebellion still had issues finding permanent bases, and their fleet was still rather small, so it was pretty difficult to find places for squadrons to operate from. The Rebel Alliance really didn't start holding massive amounts of territory until after the death of the Emperor at Endor. It was during this transitional period where the Rebel Alliance would rebrand themselves the New Republic that we would see the creation of the first mixed starfighter unit, Alphabet Squadron. Alphabet Squadron was more or less pieced together by a Rebel intelligence officer named Karen Aiden. While Aiden had very little experience running a starfighter squadron, what he did specialize in was intelligence gathering, surgical strikes, and special forces tactics and training. He believed in the New Republic's mission of demilitarization, and he realized that smaller units that were effectively led could be much more efficient than sending entire fleets to fight the enemy. Alphabet Squadron was created with the sole intention of bringing down the 204th Imperial Fighter Wing, an elite TIE fighter unit that was involved in Operation Cinder. Alphabet Squadron was made up of a group of ragtag veterans and was made up of one Y-Wing, one A-Wing, one X-Wing, one U-Wing, and one B-Wing. Initially, Alphabet Squadron faced a lot of the issues that we discussed in the beginning of the video when it comes to fielding a mixed starfighter unit. And after one training mission, one of Alphabet Squadron's A-Wings gets damaged, and it takes several weeks to fix the fighter because of a lack of spare parts. This puts the entire unit out of action. As a matter of fact, Aiden didn't even have any support for Alphabet Squadron. They basically had to beg General Harrison Dula for a berth on the New Republic carrier, the Lodestar, and had to rely on other squadrons' mechanics for repair. While Alphabet Squadron would be outnumbered and probably struggle against a TIE fighter squadron, they were quite flexible because of the makeup of the ships. The B-Wing specifically could do massive amounts of damage, and although there were B-Wing units like Blade Squadron, these types of units required an entire squadron of escort fighters as well. It actually does make more sense for B-Wings to fly with a mixed squadron because they were essentially useless in the dogfights and always needed support, unlike the more flexible Y-Wing. Now, Alphabet Squadron would perform quite well and inspire new mixed squadrons like Vanguard. Instead of having a B-Wing, a second X-Wing was added to balance out the capabilities of the squadron. Units like Vanguard and Alphabet Squadron, because of their flexibility and smaller size, were usually assigned to long-term special projects. So there you have it, guys. That is the evolution of Rebel Alliance starfighter squadrons. We basically go from these larger units that are uniformly made up of one type of ship to these much smaller, more flexible units that have a variety of different ships inside of them. I think this kind of reflects the New Republic's mentality of demilitarization. They don't want a large central fleet going into other systems to destroy everything. They much rather rely on surgical strikes, which cost less resources and also probably cause much less damage. During the Old Republic, many of the capital ships fielded by the Republic Navy featured the Hammerhead-style cockpit, and so that's where we'll be starting today's conversation. The first time we hear about this Hammerhead-style cockpit is in the ship known as the Praetorian-class frigate, which was designed by Rendelli Hyperworks, a company you should probably remember for the remainder of this video. The Praetorian-class frigate was around 180 meters in length and equipped with a hyperdrive, 2 light turbo lasers, point defense laser cannons, and it required a crew of 1,500 and could carry around 2,700 passengers. The ship was used by the Republic against the Sith during the Great Sith War. Its light armament meant that it served mainly as an escort ship in a defensive role against starfighters. After the Republic emerged from the Great Sith War victorious, they sold off a lot of their excess frigates to either private individuals or local defense forces. The ship had not only become a symbol of the Republic's victory, it was also quite functional and would become quite popular amongst the civilian population. Which is why eventually Rendelli Hyperworks would sell this design to Corellian Engineering Corporation, a company that was known for mass-producing consumer ships and had a pretty large market size to fill. Eventually, Rendelli Hyperworks would sell this design to Corellian Engineering Corporations, who, as we all know, is an expert at making consumer market ships. Now, peace wouldn't last long for the Republic, and soon the galaxy would find itself at war. This time, the Mandalorians would go on a rampage and take over huge swaths of the galaxy, pushing the Republic back towards the core worlds. The main capital ship that the Republic would rely on during this period would be the Hammerhead cruiser from Rendelli Hyperworks. Unlike the Praetorian class, the Hammerhead cruiser would actually be considered a main ship of the line. It was only slightly longer at 315 meters, but it also carried a larger assortment of turbo lasers along with point defense weapons. With its engines oriented to the rear and the weapons all located at the front of the ship, the Hammerhead cruiser specialized diving headfirst into enemy lines and breaking through their formations. This meant, of course, that the Hammerhead cruiser lacked protection and offensive firepower from the sides and the rear. But at the same time, you can imagine its front profile is extremely small, making the ship hard to hit, and because all the weapons are concentrated right here, this could be deadly in large numbers. And that's basically what the Republic would use for almost 3,000 years, so this clearly was a very viable tactic for them. Now, aside from this unique head-on design, the Hammerhead cruiser was a relatively affordable ship because it was quite small. It was also mass-produced, further decreasing the price per unit. It was said that at the height of the Mandalorian Wars, Rendelli Hyperworks would finish one of these ships every 10 days, and this would go on for several years. As we mentioned before, Rendelli Hyperworks would sell the design for the Praetorian-class frigate to the Corellians. While CEC did produce plenty of Praetorian frigates, it also would spin off its own line of capital ship. This would be known as the CR-12 Corvette, otherwise known as the Thantra-class Corvette. Despite being labeled the Corvette, this ship was similar in size to the Hammerhead cruiser, which again was around 315 meters. Besides some cosmetic differences, the Thantra class was also lightly armed compared to the Hammerhead cruiser, with only 2 twin-mounted turbo lasers and a variety of smaller point defense weapons. But its 4 banks of twin-ion engines produced a healthy amount of thrust, which meant that the Thantra class was pretty fast and agile at sub-light speeds, which is basically how most captains would use this ship to dart in and dart out of combat. Now, all the ships we talked about so far were in service together at the same time during the Old Republic era. So most likely, if you were alive during this period of time, you would be familiar with this shape for a cockpit. And this is why the Hammerhead-style cockpit was as much of a symbol for the Old Republic as the triangular-shaped Star Destroyers were a symbol for the Empire. So it's not surprising at all that during the golden age of the Republic, where demilitarization was a major factor in shipbuilding, that Rendelli Hyperworks and also Corellian Engineering Corporations would design the Svirfna-class Corvette. This Hammerhead was closer to 100 feet long, and it featured 3 laser cannons, 2 of which were forward-mounted and 1 which fired towards the rear. It also featured either 3 or 4 sublight engines depending on the configuration. So during the inter-year wars, the Hammerhead Corvette was actually mainly used as a tugboat or a freighter, so it was designed for civilian purposes and wasn't exactly maxed out when it came to how much power the engines had or how many weapons it had on board. During the Rebellion period, it would be used as a scout ship or picket ship, and some special models were also fitted with torpedoes, giving it a lot more offensive firepower. Now, due to their more civilian design, the Rebellion was able to get their hands on ships like this much more easily than something like a Gazanti-class freighter, which the Empire was using in droves. Now, despite the fact that the Hammerhead Corvette was being built for civilian purposes, it was actually still a very tough and compact ship. As a matter of fact, the entire cockpit area was heavily armored and served as almost a battering ram. This could be because it was originally used for pulling around larger ships as a tugboat. During the Battle of Scarif, the Lightmaker shows us just how powerful this tiny ship can be when it pushes an ion torpedo disabled Star Destroyer into its sister ship, sending them both plunging down into the planetary shield guarding the planet below. That's the most efficient kill I've seen since that guy in Green Squadron plunged into the bridge of the Executor. It's interesting that the Republic, which was known for its pacifism and lofty ideals and democracy, would choose a ship that looked like a hammer, which is very much oriented for offensive attack. Still, it's one of the cooler designs in Star Wars, and I really love how they used it in Rogue One. Anyway guys, in our last video while I was doing research about the various flagships in Star Wars history, I noticed a strange trend in which starships were growing progressively larger and larger with each era. Today I thought it'd be kind of cool to look at this evolution in the size of ships and why exactly this happened. Now, for the sake of time, we're going to skip the pre-Old Republic period, simply because there is a lack of information on ships during the Rakatan Infinite Empire's reign. After the fall of the Rakatans, sentient beings in the galaxy struggled to cover vast distances between systems and mostly relied on sleeper ships before the invention of the hyperdrive. Now, I originally assumed that the change and evolution in sizes for ships was a pretty linear path from, the very small Old Republic ships that we'll see in the beginning to the stupid large ones in the First Order fleet. But from what we can tell, as early as 10,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Republic Navy was fielding some pretty massive and large ships, including the Cow-class battleship. This was a 3,000 meter long battleship with a design lineage coming from the ancient Outer Rim Kumari Empire. These ships were so old that not only did they feature turbo lasers, they actually had mass drivers, a very large mass driver placed on the entire length of the ship. This is something similar to what we see in Mass Effect, and essentially it's a railgun on steroids. They're basically launching giant hunks of metal out into space. Now, this ship was designed to instill fear, and it was used for planetary bombardment. It is very possible, though, that the Kumari battleship was an outlier in galactic design, similar to what the Supremacy was, which served multiple purposes aside from being Snoke's boudoir. Perhaps a better representation of the size of Republic ships during this period of time would be the core Galaxy System dreadnoughts. In Earth military lingo, dreadnoughts were basically nicknames for battleships, the largest ships in a fleet, usually. The core Galaxy Systems dreadnoughts served as capital ships for the Old Republic Navy and were around 900 meters long and featured 1 heavy turbo laser and 16 laser cannons. Now, these ships would obviously be capital ships and command ships for much larger fleets, which would be made up of smaller, probably only a few 100-meter long frigates and cruisers. During the Great Hyperspace War in 5000 BBY, the Sith Empire's fleet was mainly comprised of Darafin-class battleships, which were around 215 meters in length. Now, had these ships been around in the latter periods of Star Wars history, they would have been considered maybe frigates at best. But the Darafin-class battleship was considered quite substantial during the Great Hyperspace War and helped the Sith Empire reach all the way to Coruscant from the Outer Rim. Rounding out their fleet were much smaller 75-meter-long Sith escort gunships. Now, I think the size of the Darafin-class battleship is a pretty good representation of ships during this period of time. If we look at the Koros system fleet, which engaged the Sith Empire during this period, their fleets were mainly made up of Supremacy attack ships, which were around 550 meters. We do have to remember, of course, that the Sith Empire's population and economic output was relatively small compared to the Republic worlds, so it makes sense that their vessels would be a lot smaller. Now, it's very possible that the Sith Empire's fleet was also limited because they lacked orbital shipyards like the ones we see in the Republic, and so they basically had to build their ships on the ground and somehow launch them into the atmosphere. Now, the period of time between 5000 BBY and 1000 BBY was perhaps one of the most terrifying and violent periods of Star Wars history. The Republic would see multiple galaxy-wide wars against the Sith, numerous civil wars within Jedi and Sith factions, and several Cold Wars that shattered the galactic economy and isolated large portions of the Republic from Coruscant. It was also during this time period that we saw the Republic absorb more territory and lesser empires, and at the same time establish a federal navy and rely on that instead of planetary defense forces. The signature ship of the Old Republic during this period was the Hammerhead bridge design. These ships were heavily focused on frontal attacks and heavily featured heavy armor and armament at the front of the ship. You had ships like the Praetorian-class frigate, which was 180 meters in length, and the theTie corvette, which would go on to replace it. These smaller ships were generally used in an escort role or for screening enemy fighters from larger capital ships. At the core of the Old Republic Navy was the 315-meter-long Hammerhead class cruiser. These ships of the line served as the backbone of the Republic Navy all the way until the New Sith War 3,000 to 4,000 years later. For command ships, the Old Republic Navy would utilize larger ships like the 600-meter Interdictor class cruiser, which was also classified as a destroyer by some military historians. Then he had the even larger Inexpugnable class tactical command ship, which was 3,100 meters in diameter, making it easily the largest Old Republic Navy ship. While these command ships were massive and equal to size to the Lucre Hulk battleships we would see during the Clone Wars, we have to remember that the 315-meter-long Hammerhead class was still the most common ship of the line, performing a role similar to what the Venator-class Star Destroyer would have had during the Clone Wars or the Imperial-class Star Destroyer during the Galactic Civil War. Now, it's during this time that we would see the Sith embrace the concept of larger and larger vessels because, hey, they love destruction. During the Great Galactic War, the Sith wielded a massive fleet of Harrower-class dreadnoughts, which were around 800 meters, and more than twice the size of the Hammerhead cruiser. These ships had 32 turbo lasers, making them very similar in function to an Imperial-class Star Destroyer. These were clearly battleships designed to exchange turbo laser fire at close ranges. It was actually said that Palpatine designed the Imperial-class Star Destroyer after the Harrower. Then you had the Centurion-class battlecruiser, which, like the Interdictor, originally was created for the Republic Navy, but after the fall of Revan, was used by the Sith as well. The Centurion battlecruiser was 1,200 meters long and designed to replace the Expungable-class command ship. Although it was similar in size to the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, the Centurion only had 6 medium turbo lasers and 6 heavy ion cannons, which means it was more outfitted like a Venator-class Star Destroyer because it also had a very large complement of fighters on board. The millennia before the Ruusan Reformation occurred was widely considered the Dark Ages of the galaxy. It was a period of time that saw constant warfare between the Sith and the Jedi, the destruction of large portions of the galaxy's infrastructure and communication links. Entire worlds were lost and regressed to primitive societies. The Jedi Order and Galactic Republic had to make extreme sacrifices and changes to their organizations in order to survive. Technology itself stagnated, and the design of ships and military weapons also regressed. The Ruusan Reformation finally signaled an end to this very dark period in Star Wars history, and it ushered in an era of demilitarization, peace, and economic expansion. This golden age of the Republic also limited the need for larger military ships. After the disbanding of the Federal Navy, the galaxy once again returned to the dependence on local defense forces. One of the few ships that were mass-produced for the Galactic Republic was the Dreadnought-class heavy cruiser, which were 600-meter-long battleships, a clear reduction in size from the 1,200-meter-long Centurion-class and 800-meter-long Harrower-class. The Republic really didn't deploy any large dreadnoughts during this period, but what you did have were rich shipyard worlds like Huat, which had large command vessels in their own fleets. The Procurator-class battlecruiser was the first of its class and the flagship of the Huat Defense Force. It was 2,500 meters long and would be the first of many massive super-class destroyers that would later dominate the galaxy. The size and armament of these early battlecruisers, however, would be severely limited by demilitarization and the regulations in place to make sure that large, massive ships were not being built. The creation of the Free Trade Zone in the outer rim of the galaxy was done in order to encourage more capital investment in this area of the galaxy. This essentially led to large corporate entities privatizing entire systems. Now, these corporations were forced to provide safety and security for their worlds and shipping lanes, and so they began outfitting merchant ships with weapons and armor and shields. By the start of the Clone Wars in 22 BBY, the Confederacy of Independent Systems Navy was made up of mostly converted merchant ships. At the core of this navy was the Munificent-class Star Frigate, a heavily automated 825-meter-long ship that was originally designed to haul freight and then eventually was required for escort duty and anti-piracy patrols. The Lucrehulk series, which was 3,000 meters in diameter, was a cargo freighter that was upgraded into a battleship as well. Its massive internal hangars could carry a ridiculous amount of war material, including millions of battle droids. It should be noted, like here on Earth, merchant ships are much larger on average than military vessels, simply because scaling up the amount of cargo you haul will increase profits. This means at the outset of the Clone Wars, the average CIS Navy ship was massive. This was followed by even larger military vessels like the 1,000 and 2,000 meter variants of the Providence-class dreadnought and the 4,845-meter-long Subjugator-class heavy cruiser. In response, the Galactic Republic Navy, which was made up of assault carriers and smaller frigates, they basically had to upscale their own ships of the line. The Venator-class Star Destroyer, which was around 1,200 meters in length, was very similar in design and function and size to the Centurion battle cruisers of the Old Republic period. It was by far the most common capital ship used by the Republic. And when the Galactic Empire came to power, it would also be replaced by the Victory-class Star Destroyer and eventually the 1,600-meter-long Imperial-class Star Destroyer. Now, these massive battleships would take more cues from the Sith Empire's Harrower-class Star Destroyers and feature large banks of turbolasers. At the same time, Emperor Palpatine was overseeing large nationalization projects of many of the resources in the galaxy and many industries. He was also trying to expand the military-industrial complex and expand the military in general. And so the Galactic Republic military would experience tremendous growth during this period of time. Palpatine would go on to embrace the Tarkin Doctrine, which heavily favored impressive and large starships that were supposed to, in theory, scare the populace into submission. Quad Drive yards started pumping out larger and larger battlecruisers until we have the Super Star Dreadnought classes like the Executor class and the Eclipse Command ship that would become Palpatine's own personal ship. Now, these dreadnoughts could be up to 12 kilometers long, which made them essentially flying cities. They're basically the size of Manhattan Island, but this fully embraced the Sith concept of rule through fear and strength. But these weren't necessarily the most financially and strategically wise decisions. Time and time again, the Rebellion and Resistance, which would fight the Imperial Remnant First Order faction, would show us that smaller Starfighters equipped with precision munitions could disable and even destroy these large vessels. So if you take a look at the first 10,000 years we talk about, the size of the average ship of the line didn't change much. I mean, they generally range from the 200 to the 500 meter length. And I think it really depended on which faction you were looking at when it came to size, more than just the evolution of time. But from the Clone Wars till the First Order Resistance War, which was about a 50-year period of time, you did see a massive increase in the size of ships, mainly because the Galactic Empire was able to consolidate the entire galaxy under its control and also expand its military to a massive amount. You also had that Tarkin Doctrine kind of mentality, which really ended up building and creating very, very massive ships. In the original Star Wars, Gold Squadron's Y-Wings were patched together and pushed to their engineering limits, just like the film, which had a relatively small budget and pushed filmmaking technology to its limits. In the prequels, we saw the Y-Wing in its original shiny form, covered in armor. Just like the prequel films, which look shinier as well, with all that CGI, but not necessarily better. But of course, that design would grow on us as it started filling out with more content. And now in the sequel era, the Y-Wings return once again. It's way past its expiration date, and while internally things have pretty much stayed the same, key components have been replaced due to aging, but the structural integrity of the airframe is still highly questionable from overuse and lack of original design and innovation. Things look shaky, but cross your fingers, we're all hoping for the best. And even though it's something we've seen before, it's still far better than those terribly designed, far too large star fortresses. It might have looked cool, but ultimately, its poor performance almost doomed the entire fleet. Okay, that's as much metaphor as I can do right now because that stuff makes my brain hurt, which is also why I recommend our viewers always to start off their day with a thick, juicy slab of pork bacon. Due to their natural high fat concentration and diet, porgs are basically bacon trees that can walk around on 2 tiny feet and should not be seen as anything else. Just like Mama used to make. Alright guys, on to the video now. Let's take a look at the evolution of the Y-Wing, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button down below because apparently YouTube's robot overlords are trying to separate us from you guys, which really shouldn't happen during this holiday season. The start of the Clone Wars surprised everyone in the galaxy who wasn't in on the plan. This included most shipyards and manufacturers aside from Quad Drive Yards and its subsidiaries who helped design the Venator and Acclimator class warships. The galaxy had been at peace for a pretty long time, and so aside from a few judicial warships and some core world planetary defense forces, there was really no need for more military ships. This meant that there was a shortage of new designs for more specialized wartime starfighters. At the Battle of Geonosis, the Republic's limited Starfighter Corps was made up of small snub fighters like the Delta 7 Aether Sprite and the V-19 Torrent Starfighter prototypes. Both of these fighters were light interceptors and lacked the firepower to do real damage against larger capital ships. To make matters worse, the Venator-class Star Destroyer was also delayed, so the Republic Navy had to depend on the Acclimator assault ship, which was really just an armed transport. And they also had diplomatic cruisers used by the Judicial Department. And even when the Venator-class Star Destroyer was ready for battle, it still wasn't really a traditional ship of the line. It lacked the firepower of similar ships in its class and relied on a large complement of fighters for offensive and defensive firepower. What the Republic really needed was an assault starfighter, which is where the BLTB Y-Wing came into play. The Y-Wing was a product of Cohen-Sayre Manufacturing, a company more known for manufacturing Starship components rather than starships itself. As a matter of fact, it was estimated that 1 in 5 starships in the galaxy had at least one component from this company, which means, Steve, as you're sitting there in your transport shuttle on your way to work, you're probably being kept in the air by a component from Cohen-Sayre Manufacturing. Now, the BLTB was still in prototype phase and undergoing testing at the Cohen-Sayre facility near the planet of Bormus when the war started. But the Republic Navy couldn't really wait any longer. Not only was it being outgunned by the Separatists, it was now also outnumbered. Rumors of Confederate superweapons were starting to reach Coruscant, and they seemed to be linked to the disappearance of entire Republic battle groups. This threat turned out to be a Subjugator-class heavy cruiser with a massive ion cannon which could disable entire fleets with a single shot. What the Republic needed was a ship that was maneuverable enough to avoid that ion blast, but at the same time carry enough munitions to take out the Subjugator heavy cruiser. Legends say Anakin Skywalker immediately recognized that the Republic lacked the proper tools for such a mission and went on an unsanctioned visit to Cohen-Sayre's testing facility and commandeered a flight of BLTB Y-Wing prototypes. He selected some of the most skilled pilots in the JR Navy and formed Shadow Squadron. Now in spreadsheets, the Y-Wing doesn't really look all that special. But at 23 meters in length, it was surprisingly long. For reference, the Jedi Fighter or Delta 7s were only 8 meters in length, and an ARC 173-seater fighter was just under 13 meters long. As a matter of fact, the BLTB Y-Wing was only about a foot shorter than the U-Wing, which served as a small dropship. But the length was misleading because more than half of the length of the ship was taken up by dual R200 ion jet engines, which themselves had a large empty space behind them that also took up half of the space of the engine. This empty space was supposedly used as a passage to redirect power for the thrust vectoring that was available on this ship. It also could have been a way to conceal the ion engine's massive heat signature. Just for reference, so that we fully understand how large these engines are, here's a single R200 next to some stormtroopers. This thing probably ate A-wings for breakfast. But these engines were necessary because the BLTB was quite a bulky ship as well. It had a 2-person crew, including a pilot and a gunner, along with an astromech. It was also heavily armed with forward-facing medium laser cannons, an ion cannon turret, and a proton torpedo launcher that could hold up to 10 projectiles, which also included ion munitions. The Y-Wing also had a bomb bay which could launch proton bombs. This ship easily dwarfed anything the Republic Starfighter Corps had, but it was just quick enough to outmaneuver the Separatist supership's ion blasts and was able to take the weapon out of commission. Now, if you're looking at a Y-Wing as a fighter first and then a bomber, you're going to be severely disappointed. Even with its rear turret gunner, the Y-Wing was simply too large to really maneuver against something smaller, especially a droid fighter, which lacked many of the components a manned fighter would need. But if you look at a BLTB Y-Wing as a gunship, it's more than formidable for its role. It had forward-facing medium blasters, which were quite powerful and could take out escort ships, and the proton torpedoes could basically destroy anything. The Galactic Republic also had excellent interceptors, which could escort a Y-Wing on more dangerous missions. Even then, the Y-Wing's straightaway speed was no joke and could help it get out of tough situations. With the fall of the Republic and the rise of the New Order, the BLTB-Y was quickly sidelined. The Empire's new naval doctrine and strategy was built around a fleet of massive capital ships, heavy firepower, and cheap and light point defense interceptors. There was no room in this new navy for large, bulky, hyperdrive-equipped snub fighters like the Y-Wing. Overnight, Corsair Manufacturing lost all of its contracts to the Empire and had to sell all of its stock to local planetary defense forces and security outfits. Remember, the Clone Wars came to a stop very abruptly. The Separatists were still fighting in the Outer Rim siege, but the war seemed like it was going to go on for quite some time. Emperor Palpatine had nationalized the banks, increased the size of the Grand Army of the Republic, and printed more money to cover all these new military costs. Manufacturers like Corsair actually expected more orders of the Y-Wing rather than less. So what you had was a massive amount of lightly used Y-Wings that now needed a place to be stored. And so for the next few years on worlds like Bracca, scrapper guilds focused on turning ships ranging from tiny interceptors to battleships into cash by breaking them down to their smallest components. Many brand new ships were completely wasted instead of properly being stored or reused. It was easier, of course, to store a Y-Wing than, say, a full Venator-class Star Destroyer or a Lucre Hulk battleship. So 20 years later, there still are quite a few Y-Wings left at the Empire's numerous lightly guarded stockpiles and storage centers, which is of course where the Rebel Alliance comes into the scene. You see, the Rebellion had a lot of problems that were similar to the Republic Navy's problems at the onset of the Clone Wars. The Rebellion with its A-Wings and X-Wings lacked an assault fighter that could actually do significant damage to an Imperial-class Star Destroyer. In these earlier days, the Rebellion didn't even have access to anything larger than stolen Imperial medical frigates. But those are way too slow for the Rebels' famous slash-and-run attacks. The Y-Wing was hyperdrive equipped and had enough speed to join a task force of X-Wings and A-Wings and quickly appear out of hyperspace, attack a target, and then disappear. There was a problem though. The BLTB Y-Wing would have been almost 20 years old by this time, and it would have been out of production for a similarly long period of time. There were still spare parts and equipment lying around for the Y-Wing, but the sources weren't steady enough to reliably keep an entire wing of these ships in the air. The Rebel mechanics therefore had to be very creative and figure out how to keep the Y-Wings running without OEM parts. Now, a lot of their fixes worked, but it also significantly decreased the reliability of the Y-Wing, and so the armor panels, aside from the ones on the cockpit, were all removed to give the mechanics quick access to the interior components of the ship. This included the very long engine cowlings that kind of give the Y-Wing that wishbone look. The removal of all this paneling also made the Y-Wing considerably faster. The rear ion turret was also removed, saving even more space and weight. The Rebel Alliance was just way too low on personnel at the time to supply a gunner for each one of these Y-Wings. But it probably would have helped Gold Squadron quite a lot had they had rear-facing ion blasters while they were making the trench run, but who knows? The new modified version of the Y-Wing was now only 16 meters long and much faster and more maneuverable. The single-seater Y-Wing was known as the BTLA-4, and it was considered a workhorse for the Rebel Alliance. At the Battle of Scarif, Gold Squadron scored a critical hit on the Star Destroyer Persecutor with ion torpedoes, which disabled it, allowing the Lightmaker Hammerhead Corvette to ram the Persecutor into its sister ship. The BTLA-4 would valiantly serve in every major battle after Scarif until the end of the war. The Rebellion also had a two-seater Y-Wing model that was still stripped down, known as a BTLS-3. This model of the Y-Wing was used for reconnaissance missions. The Rebel Alliance success with the venerable Y-Wing definitely raised its popularity in the galaxy. And although the Republic was demilitarizing their federal military, this also meant that local defense forces were increasing their budgets. Many of these planetary defense forces were commanded by galactic Civil War veterans who had seen the Y-Wing in action firsthand. Corsair Manufacturing seized on this new opportunity and created a new Y-Wing for a new generation. The funny thing is, the model that the Galaxy had fallen in love with and was in demand was actually the BTL Custom Series, which had been jury-rigged together by Rebel mechanics in the middle of a war zone. So instead of trying to bring back the much heavier and sleeker-looking BLTB Y-Wing from the Clone Wars, Corsair decided to mass-produce the BTL stripped-down version with a few of their own custom upgrades. This included a pair of R750 ion jet engines, which were a little longer than the R200s, but a lot more powerful, and because they were stripped down, they were still much shorter than the Clone Wars version. The new Y-Wing also was made of stronger and lighter titanium reinforced alloy steel, along with upgrades to all of its internal components and weaponry. The manufacturers also offered a special trim which could make your Y-Wings look like the Clone Wars era with a full armored body kit, which is probably the one I would get. The BTA-NR-2, as it was called, was mainly used to patrol hyperspace lanes and to fill out planetary defense forces. After the complete and utter failure of the star fortresses and the evacuation to Dakar, the Resistance will no doubt be looking for a better alternative to fill all of their bombing needs. The Y-Wing was created by Cohensayer, a Starship components manufacturing company that rarely designed starfighters, which meant that the Y-Wing was something that was designed from scratch without no pre-existing models. The A-Wing, on the other hand, was designed by Quat Systems Engineering, one of the largest and oldest shipyards in the galaxy. Through their main orbital shipyard over Quat and their hundreds of subsidiaries, both public and secret, they controlled a massive portion of the shipbuilding market, which meant that not only were their ships top of the line and made from the best materials backed by the best research, they usually also had a long lineage as well. And so to get to the A-Wing, we have to start way before the first A-Wing was drawn on some designer's datapad. We have to go back to the golden age of the Republic before the Clone Wars even started. And you guys all probably know by now the drill. The Galactic Republic had been demilitarized for almost 1,000 years, and so manufacturers of warships had shifted focus to creating more civilian products. Demand for military ships basically came from two different types of customers. You had your local defense forces, which usually were looking for snub fighters, frigates, corvettes, and maybe one or two cruisers. You did have larger core world defense fleets, which would have been more robust and filled out with ships of the line, more commonly seen during the Old Republic age. But for the most part, the galaxy's military readiness had been at its lowest point in a long time, which meant that Commander Shepard could have done a better job when going through the single-player campaign. The other customer would have been the Republic's Judicial Department. This was sort of like the Galactic Republic's version of the FBI or the Coast Guard. The Judicials focused on settling disputes, tracking down interstellar criminals, and also protecting the hyperspace lanes from pirates and bandits. When larger conflicts arose, the Judicials would call upon the help of nearby local defense forces to combat enemy fleets. Because the Judicials were a peacekeeping force, their ships usually didn't have the best offensive capabilities, but they were usually quite well defended and quite fast. The Jedi Order were coordinated within the Judicials, and they were provided with Republic starships for their missions. The Jedi, of course, had special abilities and also special needs. In the past, they might have used civilian ships or military ships designed for ordinary pilots, but now for the first time, the Republic wanted to create custom ships just for the Jedi and their special talents. Their role as peacekeepers and diplomats continued to grow as the underfunded and understaffed Judicial Department struggled to keep the peace, especially in the Outer Rim. The Republic contracted Quat Drive Yards for the project, and Welix Blissick, a Starship engineer who would become one of the most talented and prolific ship designers in the galaxy, would be assigned to the job. Welix was a huge fan of the sleek-looking R-class tactical strike fighters used by the Old Republic thousands of years ago. The 9-meter-long fighters had S-foils that opened up like a butterfly knife and were known as A-wings at the time. The Auric fighter and its many variants served the Republic for a ridiculously long time. They were used as early as 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin during the Mandalorian Wars and were still seen during the New Sith Wars up till the Ruusan Reformation 3,000 years later. It would be like seeing an Egyptian war chariot on our own modern battlefield today. Blissick really liked how minimalistic and small the Auric's body frame was. It was almost comparable in size to a droid fighter and would have looked tiny next to a more traditional snub fighter of that period. Droid fighters had a lot of advantages. They didn't have cockpits, inertial compensators, or life support systems, and they usually didn't need as much armor. This allowed their design to be extremely small, presenting a tiny profile for enemies chasing them, and also allowed them to be extremely nimble. The Jedi were kind of similar to droid pilots. They did need cockpits, but they didn't need extra sensors and a lot of these other flight aids that a normal pilot would need. And this was because they had the Force. Some Jedi were even able to make hyperspace jumps using their own special power. And so the Delta 7 Aether Sprite class light interceptor was born. At just 8 meters long, the Delta 7 was built around 2 massive thrusters and little else. There was a very light deflector shield, dual lasers, no hyperdrive, the ship relied on booster rings, and no heavier munitions. What resulted was a ship that could outclass any other ship at sublight speeds and was also extremely maneuverable and was extremely difficult for anyone to pilot. You either had to have force powers or be a weird alien with fast reflexes. A Doug might have been able to do it. The controls were set to be so responsive even at slow speed that a Jedi could never get their starship valet parked. While the ship was terrific for the Jedi on their diplomatic or anti-criminal missions, the beginning of the Clone Wars exposed a major flaw in the ship's design. The Delta 7 was ridiculously thin. It was so thin that a full astromech couldn't even be docked onto the ship. You could only fit the head of an astromech. This also meant you could forget about any substantial armor. Then there were the shields, which were kind of useless against military-grade lasers. The Jedi could easily outmaneuver a single fighter in a dogfight and avoid its fire, but in a larger space battle, debris and stray laser bolts were much harder to avoid. What the Jedi really needed was a ship that could survive the rigors of a massive dogfight. Flying a Delta 7 into battle was like driving a Corvette onto a modern battlefield. It just wasn't the right tool for the job. And as Jedi pilot casualties started adding up in the beginning of the war, a lot of Jedi started protesting for a new ship. The Delta 7B was created with a slightly thicker hull, allowing full astromechs to dock on, but still the ship was quite vulnerable to stray enemy fire. Although some Jedi, like Master Plo Koon, would continue flying the Delta 7 until his unfortunate friendly fire incident. Now, boys and girls, it might look cool to have your IFF tag switched off, but there's nothing cool about being dead. The ETA-2 Actus, also designed by Quant Systems Engineering, served as a replacement for the Delta 7. It featured S-foils and a shorter fuselage, heavier weapons, and overall was more advanced. Oddly enough, the first version of the ETA Actus had no shields at all, which meant it caused even more protests from within the Jedi Order. I'm actually pretty convinced that this was all Palpatine's plan to put the Jedi in very fragile ships, increasing their casualties. It's definitely something he would do, and this is why I'm really happy he's coming back. The ETA Actus will go on to inspire the Senior Fleet Systems TIE Fighter line, while the Delta 7 quietly faded away. Well, it didn't completely fade away. It was still a remarkable ship, and Quant Systems Engineering saw some more potential in the design. Despite the mysterious disappearance of the Jedi, they still saw promise in an extremely fast and lightly armed interceptor. This would lead to the R-22 Spearhead prototype, which was supposed to improve on a lot of the Delta 7's shortcomings. Unfortunately, the Empire shut down that program before they could go into mass production. The prototypes that were left were eventually purchased by the Monarch of Tammuz-An, a small world on the border of Hutt space. From a design standpoint, the R-22s were said to have tested the limits of maneuverability and speed. Decades later, the Rebel Alliance were looking for a starship that was suitable for their little organization, and they ran into the R-22s. Rebel engineers swapped out some of the original engines for a pair of more modern Novaldex J-77s and updated all the sensors, computers, and weapons aboard, and the RZ-1 A-Wing interceptor was born. Even shorter than the Delta 7B, the A-Wing was only 6.9 meters long and was an engineering marvel. The scientists at Quant Systems Engineering had somehow managed to fit a Class 1 hyperdrive inside the ship, along with concussion missiles, shields, armor plating, and a lot of other things. And still, it was faster than any other mass-produced ship at sublight speeds. The inclusion of hyperdrive and heavier missions was especially important for a ragtag group like the Rebellion, who could only strike from the shadows and would be completely destroyed in a prolonged fight. Now, at its core, the RZ-1A still took the Delta 7B's philosophy of taking two gigantic engines and then strapping a pilot to it, and this time around, it was at least a little bit more maneuverable and manageable for a non-Force user. But to be an A-Wing interceptor pilot, one usually had to prove themselves on the more stable T-65 X-Wing platform. The A-Wing was definitely a lot tougher than the Delta 7B, but it still couldn't take much damage, but its speed more than made up for it. As the war continued, the Empire desperately scrambled to develop a starfighter that could counter the A-Wing's unique abilities. The TIE Interceptor was the result, but it still lacked the same straight-line sublight speed that the A-Wing was famous for. As the war continued and the Empire gradually replaced the basic TIE in-space superiority fighter with more advanced models, Rebel pilots began modifying, or more like stripping down, their A-Wings, removing heavy weapons, shields, and even armor to increase their speed. It was one of these modified A-Wings piloted by Green Leader Admiral Krynid, which crashed through the bridge of the Executor, causing the Superstar Destroyer to crash into the second Death Star, which probably makes it one of the most cost-efficient kills in galactic history. Towards the end of the Galactic Civil War, the RZ-2A was designed and manufactured. It was kind of based off of the R-22 prototype and also the RZ-1A. What resulted was an interceptor with a slightly longer fuselage and several of the modifications Rebel mechanics had made to the RZ-1 during the Galactic Civil War. The RZ-2 was even faster than the RZ-1, and one of the interesting additions made to the ship was a pair of Zija Go-4 laser cannons attached on swiveling cannon mounts on the wings. This allowed the A-Wing to strafe targets for a longer period of time, and it also allowed the pilots to fire off board. That meant even firing behind them when they're getting chased. The RZ-2 A-Wing also was far more reliable than the Rebel version of the Interceptor, which oftentimes spent as much time in the repair bay as on the battlefield. Once again, we have to go back in time to the legendary Old Republic era to the Mandalorian Wars, which happened 4,000 years before Luke sent a proton torpedo up the poop chute of the first Death Star. As we mentioned in our last episode, the Mandalorians were a very diverse group of people whose culture revolved completely around warfare. Many of their weapons and vehicles were so well designed that they would later influence the designs of other Star Wars factions. Prior to 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Mandalorians were content on carrying out small raids on Outer Rim Republic outposts. But gradually, a movement known as the Neo-Crusaders began to grow amongst the Mandalorian ranks. They believed that in order for the Mandalorians to achieve great success, they would have to band together and be more disciplined. When the Mandalorian War broke out, legends has it the Mandalorian leader used the Neo-Crusaders as the vanguard against the Old Republic. Since the Neo-Crusaders were the spear point of the Mandalorian offense, their warships also looked like spears. Well, actually they kind of look like daggers, and if you look closely, they might remind you of another ship we're going to be talking about later. Now, not much is known about the specs of this ship, but we do know that it is equipped with anti-capital ship missiles and was used to board other Republic ships. What makes the Neo-Crusader ship so interesting is that it looks completely different from any other design in the Mandalorian fleet. Now, we later find out that the Mandalorian leader was influenced by a Sith Lord to start the war, so it's possible that there are some connections between the Neo-Crusaders and some Sith designs, but we'll talk about that later. In response to the Mandalorian onslaught, the Republic commissioned a new line of starships to supplement their Hammerhead cruisers. This was known as the Interdictor-class cruiser. These 600-meter-long ships were gigantic for the time and featured a huge offensive armament along with a large attachment of fighters. More importantly, it was one of the first known ships to feature an interdictor gravity well, which could pull ships out of hyperspace and prevent them from going into hyperspace. The triangle-shaped ship would become the precursor to many later wedge-shaped designs. After finally defeating the Mandalorian threat, the Jedi leader Revan fell to the dark side and took the Republic fleet along with several Interdictor-class cruisers with him to the Sith Empire. While in exile, Revan found a super weapon known as the Starforge. It could build endless amounts of ships, vehicles, and other war material using the power of a star. Revan used this forge, which essentially was a cheat code, to spawn an enormous fleet of Interdictor-class cruisers, which he would turn against the Republic. While all of this was going on, the Sith Emperor was quietly building the real invasion fleet, and at the center of it was the extremely beautiful Harrower-class Dreadnought. This 800-meter behemoth was designed in the classic Sith wedge shape. It turns out the triangle-shaped design was a Sith design that goes as far back as 5,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, which predates even the Neo-Crusader Mandalorian ship we first talked about. Maybe the Sith Emperor gave the Neo-Crusaders that ship design. Who knows? Anyway, the Harrower-class Dreadnought was designed not only as a warship, but also a troop carrier and could carry over 7,000 Sith troopers. Along with that, the Harrower-class Dreadnought had a complement of 95 Mark VI Supremacy fighters, along with 32 B-28 Extinction-class bombers and 35 shuttles. These exited the ship through its unique forward-facing dual hangar bays. The Harrower class was more than just the capital ship. It was used as a forward operations base, a strategy that the Republic and the Galactic Empire would later adopt. For the next few thousand years, the Republic and Sith forces would battle each other, and ship designs wouldn't really drastically change all that much. For instance, the Republic Hammerhead cruiser, which saw action as early as 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, was still used 3,000 years later during the time of Darth Bane and the new Sith Wars. At the time, the Brotherhood of Darkness deployed the Sith Star Destroyer. We don't really have any images on the ship, but I'm guessing it was also in a wedge shape. Now, Legends has it 10 years before the Clone Wars even began, a new line of wedge-shaped assault ships known as the Acclamator class was already going through its testing phase. Designed to carry up to 16,000 clone troopers, several of these 752-meter-long ships were ready to go by the time the Jedi had found the clone army. But the Acclamator was more of a troop carrier than it was a true ship of the line. This is why the Republic created the Venator-class Star Destroyer, which oddly enough looks very similar to the Mandalorian warship we talked about earlier. The Venator class also featured many similarities to the Sith Dreadnoughts of old, which isn't surprising because a Sith Lord by the name of Darth Plagueis was the one who placed the order for these ships in the first place. The Venator class was 1,137 meters long and carried up to 7,400 clone troopers. While it lacked the same amount of firepower that later Imperial Star Destroyers had, it more than made up for it with a huge complement of starfighters, which included 192 fighters, 192 interceptors, 36 long-range fighters, along with 40 gunships and a prefabricated garrison base. If anything, this rendition of the Star Destroyer was more of a carrier than it was a capital ship. The Republic Army by this point had fully embraced the idea of using Star Destroyers as forward operating bases for all of their battles. The Venator-class Star Destroyer would serve the Republic well for the next few years. It wasn't until the end of the Clone Wars that they introduced a new design known as the Victory-class Star Destroyer. At 900 meters long, the Victory-class Star Destroyer design is immediately recognizable to any Imperial Navy sailor, as it would become the template for all future Imperial Star Destroyers. With the Victory-class Star Destroyer, we see a shift away from capital ships that have a lot of fighters and weaker firepower to capital ships with less fighters and much more firepower. The one major flaw with the Victory class was its underpowered propulsion system, which allowed smaller, faster ships to withdraw from combat. This was later remedied by the Mark II version of the ship. But that didn't really matter because that's when the Imperial Star Destroyer was first deployed. At over 1,600 meters, this deadly capital ship was equipped with just enough firepower to subdue an entire system or wipe out a small rebel fleet. It fully embraced the Imperial firepower first strategy by employing 60 heavy turbo lasers, 60 ion cannons, and dozens of other auxiliary weapons emplacements. This more than made up for the Star Destroyer's small complement of short-range fighters and bombers. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer could transport an entire legion of stormtroopers along with all of their fun toys. The New Order was a golden age for triangle-shaped ships. We saw many different creative designs, like the Immobilizer-class cruiser, which later led to the Interdictor-class Star Destroyer. Then there was the Super Star Destroyer classes like the Executor and the Eclipse, which were both several kilometers long. After the Battle of Jakku, the majority of the Imperial fleet was destroyed, but many Imperial-class Star Destroyers, along with the Emperor's Eclipse Super Star Destroyer, managed to escape to the Unknown Region, where they started the First Order. Many of the Imperial-class Star Destroyers would be refit with an automated maintenance system which would decrease the crew size. But the backbone of the First Order fleet was made up of the impressive Resurgent-class Star Destroyer. At 2,950 meters long, this massive warship had a stupid amount of firepower, with over 1,500 turbo lasers. A number so high I had to triple check my sources. The Resurgence class had a massive crew of 74,000 people, but could only carry a surprising low number of stormtroopers, 8,000. The Resurgent class also carried a small complement of fighters with only 2 wings of TIE interceptors. But again, who needs TIE fighters when you have 1,500 turbo lasers? Rounding out the First Order's ridiculous fleet is the Manticore 4 Siege Dreadnought. Last Jedi spoiler for about the next minute, so you're going to want to tune out. Okay, now you might remember seeing this dreadnought in the opening scene of The Last Jedi. At 7,669 meters long, this massive ship's main armament consisted of 2 giant autocannons which were used for attacking heavily fortified targets. And like with most gigantic weapons in Star Wars, the main weapon also happened to be the ship's weak point, something that Poe Dameron took full advantage of. When the Dreadnought was destroyed, there were over 193,000 crew members on board, along with 22,000 stormtroopers. That's a lot of letters to write home to Mom and Dad. Well, actually, I think the First Order kidnapped kids to make into stormtroopers, so maybe didn't have to contact the parents. Now, the last ship we'll be talking about is Snoke's flagship Supremacy. At over 13 kilometers long and with a crew of over 2 million, this gigantic ship is getting close to Death Star 1 size. It was so big that it could dock and repair 8 Star Destroyers, 6 of them internally in hangar bays and 2 externally. Whereas most Star Destroyers were used as forward operating bases, the Supremacy was more like a First Order headquarters and shipyard. It did have a weakness, however, which was a purple-haired woman traveling at the speed of light in a Mon Calamari cruiser. Today we'll be moving on to another iconic vehicle in the Star Wars universe, the TIE Fighter. Whereas the X-Wing series from Incom was designed for independent operation, most Imperial and Sith-style fighters were designed to be tethered to a ground base or a capital ship. Going back as far as the Old Republic, the Sith kept this in mind when they were designing their fighter craft. When the fallen Jedi Revan found the Rakatan Starforge super manufacturing station, he began mass production of a starfighter simply known as the Sith Fighter. Despite being powered by mysterious ancient tech from the Rakan Empire, the Sith Starfighter was very simple in design, armed only with a laser cannon. It was mainly used in an anti-Starfighter role because of its limited range and limited firepower. The cockpit was described as extremely cramped and the whole structural integrity was labeled minimal, which is hilarious and so wrong. And even though the Sith Starfighter had some basic life support built into it, most Sith pilots wore full evac suits, in case they suddenly found themselves on the outside of their starship. While Revan was getting in touch with his darker side, the true Sith Empire had begun amassing a huge fleet to attack the Old Republic. The Sith Starfighter Corps was made up of the Mark VI Supremacy class starfighter. A step up from the Sith fighter, the Mark VI had some minimal shielding and 4 laser cannons. The Sith Navy used these ships in giant swarm tactics to overwhelm enemy targets. Life expectancy for the average Sith pilot still wasn't great though. In the midst of the Clone Wars, we once again saw a TIE Fighter-like design crop up with the ETA-2 Actis class interceptor, co-designed by Quat Drive Yards and Sonar Fleet Systems. Featuring a small ball ship canopy attached to a wing with S-foils, it was highly maneuverable and featured both laser and ion cannons. Despite not having a hyperdrive on board, the Actis class had a slot for astromechs, and pilots could use a hyperspace ring if they needed to travel from one system to another. In the later years of the war, the Actis class interceptor was the fighter of choice for many Jedi. Some pilots, like Anakin Skywalker, decreased the weight of his fighter by removing sensors and other flight aids that were unnecessary for a powerful Force user. This made the ship even lighter and more maneuverable. This was one of the few fighters in the New Republic that didn't have any shielding. But despite being lightly armored, during the Battle of Coruscant, the slower ARC-170 starfighter suffered much heavier casualties than starfighters like the ETA-2 or V-Wing. This caught the eye of Sonar Fleet Systems when they began developing the next generation of fighters. They decided to stick with the ETA-2 philosophy of lighter and more maneuverable airframes. This new design would become known as the TIE Fighter. It incorporated many design features from the ETA-2 and V-Wing. Sonar enlarged the vertical radiator panels and viewport and also kept the twin ion engine design. On top of that, they added solar panels on the wings to make it more environmentally friendly. These TIE fighters were much cheaper to produce, and with thousands if not millions of systems to patrol, the Empire needed quantity. Quality didn't matter as much, especially after the remaining Separatist outposts were crushed. The majority of battles the Empire now fought were against pirates, criminals, and civilians. The TIE Fighter was used as an air and space superiority craft and could handle most civilian ships, even ones with military modifications. But as the alliance to restore the Republic became more organized and well-equipped, the TIE Fighters started encountering problems, especially against the Rebel X-Wings and A-Wings, which had robust shields. One variant of the TIE Fighter the Empire developed was the TIE Striker. This sleek-looking vessel had wings designed with minimal drag, allowing it to outperform most starfighters in atmosphere. The basic TIE Fighter had the aerodynamic qualities of a flying brick and had to depend on inertial dampeners to stay in the air. The TIE Striker also had a large enough cockpit to transfer material and additional personnel. Even more dangerous was the Chiss Grand Admiral Thrawn's new TIE Defender. This tri-wing TIE was fully equipped with the latest Imperial technology. It had extremely strong shields, 6 laser cannons, a proton torpedo launcher, and a hyperdrive. It proved so capable and potentially devastating to the Rebellion's war effort that the famous Phoenix Squadron was assigned to destroy its main factory. Thrawn later created an advanced version called the Defender Elite, which had increased speed and shielding. Another variant was called the TIE Advanced V1. It was based off the Scimitar Sith infiltrator ship that was piloted by Darth Maul. The TIE Advanced V1 looked similar to the regular TIE, but had inward curved wings that had armor on the outsides instead of solar panels. It featured dual laser cannons and a projectile launcher which could fire useful things like a tracker beacon. This ship would be reserved only for special agents of the Empire like the Sith Inquisitors. The TIE Advanced X1 featured stubbier wings and was very heavily armored. It had shields, a hyperdrive, and dual lasers along with a cluster missile launcher. Darth Vader used this ship as his personal fighter around the time of the Battle of Yavin. It was one of the few Imperial ships that withstood the shockwave from the destruction of the first Death Star and survived. When the Empire realized that the TIE Advanced line was too expensive to manufacture in bulk, they decided to design another variant of the TIE Fighter, known as the TIE Interceptor. Primarily built to go up against the faster Rebel A-Wing, the Interceptor, like the regular TIE, lacked shields and a hyperdrive, but had an upgraded engine and a new wing design that held 4 laser cannons. But the Interceptor, along with all the other TIE Fighter variants, weren't enough to turn the tide against the rebellion after the Emperor was killed at Endor. The Imperial Remnant's forces disappeared off into the unknown region where it began rebuilding. One of the first things the First Order did was change their philosophy on starfighters, reversing the mistake that the Empire and Cinar fleet systems made during the rise of the New Order. The First Order realized that Starship pilots were more difficult to train than any other personnel, and were extremely valuable to the war effort. Their version of the TIE Fighter had greatly increased defensive capabilities like a deflector shield and improved power source, but they still lacked a hyperdrive. There was a Special Forces version of the First Order TIE Fighter which included a rear gunner position and missile launcher as well. It was also equipped with a hyperdrive which allowed it to carry out covert First Order missions when they were still hiding from the New Republic. Like the Japanese Imperial military, the Empire focused on producing lightweight, maneuverable fighters. While the Japanese were limited by their underpowered engines, the Empire was limited by the massive size of their territory and their need for a cheap and mass-produced fighter. When the rebellion shifted from guerrilla fighters to a capable resistance, the Empire failed to shift their strategy to counter ships like the X-Wing and A-Wing. Had the Empire had more advanced TIE Fighter variants earlier on, there's a chance the rebellion would have never had a chance to grow. Just think about how many times the rebellion was able to escape from the antiquated TIE Fighters. Maybe if the TIE Fighters based on the first Death Star were more capable, the 30 or so Rebel Snub Fighters would have never gotten through their defensive screen, and caused a chain of events that would collapse the galactic economy, kill a large percentage of the most talented Imperial officers and pilots, and give the rebellion the spark it needed. Well guys, that's our video for today. Let me know in the poll above which TIE Fighter you love. So today we'll be moving on to my starfighter of choice, the very versatile X-Wing Snub Fighter. The X-Wing is the result of a military strategy that focused heavily on capable multi-role fighters that could function in small groups without the support of larger capital ships. Because these starships oftentimes carried out missions far behind enemy lines in small units, they had tech and equipment that were usually only found on ships of larger classes. And the men who underestimated these mighty steeds of war oftentimes found themselves in the cold embrace of vacuum, which apparently in the Star Wars galaxy doesn't immediately kill you like it does in our own galaxy. Princess Mary Poppins, bitch! Now you can't really talk about the history of the X-Wing without talking about the Starfighter manufacturing company Incom. Known for their forward-thinking designs and very capable fighters, Incom was one of the main manufacturers that provided fighters for the Republic. Legends has it in the beginning Incom focused more on civilian projects like the construction of Bespin's Cloud City in 400 BBY. When the Separatist crisis devolved into a full-blown war, the Republic scrambled to find defense contractors to build ships and weapons to equip the Grand Army of the Republic. Incom won a contract to begin building starfighters for the Navy, and with the help of Subpro began the development and production of the Z-95 Headhunter. Often mistaken as an X-Wing from certain angles, the Z-95 lacked the S-foils that would later become synonymous with all Incom starfighters. It was a terrific all-around snub fighter armed with twin laser cannons, concussion missiles, and an ion cannon that could penetrate deflector shields. This allowed the Z-95 to fill multiple combat missions from aerial denial patrols to strike missions on capital ships and fortified targets. It also had an above-average power plant and shielding for the time and a very maneuverable airframe. But because Incom rushed to get the Z-95 battle ready for the Clone Wars, the Headhunter headed off the assembly line missing a few components that would later become standard for most military starfighters. The Z-95 lacked the hyperdrive, which limited its operation range to sublight distances away from its operations base. There was an option, however, to fit an aftermarket hyperdrive on the Headhunter, but the ship lacked a socket for an astromech droid, which meant oftentimes pilots had to input their own calculations. But without the right data, you might just end up flying right through a star or a black hole. Unless you're Han Solo. He's basically made out of magic and bad parenting. The Z-95 was famous for having a cramped cockpit, which made it hard for certain species and porkins to fit inside, which between you and me is perfectly fine because, to be honest, the Z-95 was a death trap compared to what came next. As the war went on, it became apparent that the Z-95 was quickly being outclassed by more maneuverable second-generation Separatist droid fighters. Incom and Subpro once again joined forces and created the aggressive Recon 170. As you guys all know, when you put aggressive in the name of anything, it performs better and also causes more death and destruction. The ARC 170 was the opposite of the more minimalist Z-95. Equipped with a Class 1.5 hyperdrive and two powerful sublight engines, very few starfighters could outrun the ARC 170. The ship was crewed by 3 clones, 1 pilot, 1 tail gunner, and a co-pilot. All 3 of them enjoyed different temperatures when eating their porridge. This was an odd design choice during an era where astromech droids were used to replace sentient beings to perform secondary functions, such as navigation and power and weapons systems management. But because of the long-range mission the ARC-170 was designed to undergo, it oftentimes was beneficial to have a second pilot who could take over. It also had S-foils which could be opened during a dogfight to cool down the Starship's power plant. After the fall of the Republic, the Galactic Empire still used the ARC-170 along with the Rebel Alliance, many different smuggler groups, and some drug cartels. During the rise of the First Order around a half a century later, Junata's security systems were still using this classic fighter, not only to patrol their local systems, but also to steal babies to turn into child soldiers. Now that's what I call versatility. Legends has it the Galactic Empire tried to nationalize Incom during the rise of the New Order. Many lead designers, developers, and engineers decided to leave Incom. Years later, somehow one of Incom's most advanced prototypes wound up in the hands of the Rebel Alliance. That design, of course, was the T-65B X-Wing. Designed with the intent to be fast and powerful enough to inflict damage on an Imperial Star Destroyer, the X-Wing was an accumulation of years of R&D and analysis of battle performances of previous Incom fighters like the Z-95 and ARC-170. Like a sand-heading Sith Lord in a fight with a bunch of Jedi younglings, the ship had very few weaknesses and many advantages. Starting with the iconic design featuring 2 sets of wings that functioned like a giant S-foil, giving the craft superior cooling abilities to its power plant, which ran 4 thrusters and a Class 1 hyperdrive. The single-pilot craft also had a slot for an astromech and a robust sensor system. This capable craft was perfectly suited for the Rebel strategy of using slash-and-run attacks on Imperial targets to inflict damage so devastating that it could be considered borderline genocidal. The X-Wing was equipped with 4 forward-facing lasers along with proton torpedoes to do tons of damage. The T-65C-A2 was a space superiority variant of the X-Wing, but it was extremely rare because of its complicated manufacturing process. Despite its many abilities and functions, the X-Wing was still a relatively easy fighter to fly. Its controls were said to be similar to those of another Incom craft, the T-16 Skyhopper. This was important because many of the Rebel pilots that were recruited were oftentimes laborers, criminals, farmers, and guys with impressive mustaches, who had very little proper Starship piloting experience. Incom had reformed itself into Incom Free Tech, and it began development of the T-70, which would replace the T-65. The T-70 X-Wing took advantage of new advances in the miniaturization of Starship components. Whee! Instead of having 4 thrusters, the T-70 had 2, which could be split into 4 when the S-foils were open, allowing additional cooling, which actually is what the X-Wing looked like in Ralph McQuarrie's original concept art. Very cool. The new X-Wing also had a larger variety of weapons armaments and packages available, like a small rotary cannon at the bottom of the ship or torpedo launcher tubes that could equip several different types of projectiles. But more or less, these changes were incremental from the T-65B, despite what Incom's brochures and Disney wants you to think. Officially, the T-70's limited advances are blamed on the New Republic's demilitarization, along with bureaucratic nonsense and corruption. But between you and me, I think the root of the problem lies in lazy writing. Anyway, the T-70 would be transformed into the T-85, which would be the main fighter for the New Republic. The Resistance would go on to use the T-70 because they're broke as hell. Now, the T-85, we don't really know much about it, but it seems like the only thing they've changed was add 15 to 70. I don't know, maybe they'll add a new layer of paint or something like that. We just don't know yet. But who knows, maybe we'll find out about it in the next film. Oh yeah, forgot about that. Well, maybe some X-Wing survived. What made the X-Wing so great was not just its performance, but how its design reflected the Rebellion's ideology of the importance of an individual. This was completely different from the Imperial design, which focused on low production costs and massive numbers. Well guys, thank you for sticking around till the end. As usual, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.